who will be sharing his insights on collective power, moving forward together, which is such a relevant topic to our United Way, and directly in line with this year's campaign theme, but we'll say more about that in a little bit. So John Kania is Managing Director at FSC, a global nonprofit strategic consulting firm that helps organizations achieve social impact by applying research, strategy, and evaluation to better solve social problems. John has over 20 years' experience advising senior management on issues of strategy, organization, and change management. At FSG, John leads strategic planning efforts for foundations, nonprofits, and corporate philanthropy in issues ranging from international health, U.S. healthcare, U.S. education, the environment, community development, and nonprofit capacity building. John has been published in Stanford Social Innovation Review, The Wall Street Journal, the Journal of Business Strategy, and is a featured author of Learning from the Future. He speaks frequently around the U.S. on improving the impact of philanthropy and corporate social responsibility. So it is a pleasure this morning to introduce John to our group.
Good morning, good morning.
Good morning.
Well, I have to start by saying that, this is a little bit of a homecoming for me. I actually grew up in Cheshire, Connecticut, and my parents still live there. And so I have to start by saying that you all have really given me two gifts. And the first is actually till last night. I travel around the world. I talk quite a bit, speak quite a bit, do a lot of consulting all over the world. And rarely do I get a chance to be in my own childhood bed. So last night to actually sleep in my own childhood bed and frankly, to spend time with my parents. I just live up in the Boston area. And I will say that, I don't spend enough time, with my busy life and with 3 kids and lots of stuff going on with my own parents. And so to not only sleep in my childhood bed and have dinner with them last night, but then I'll be with various parts of you all day today, but then to go back and have dinner with them tonight is a real gift to me. So thank you for bringing that to me. The second gift is just to be here with all of you and to listen to the incredible work that you are doing here in Waterbury. I've dedicated my life, I didn't start that way, but the rest of my life at this point to helping to accelerate social change writ large. And what inspires me is, all of you and the work that you do and what you're trying to accomplish here. And I just want to go back, for starters, to some of the accomplishments that Sandy identified up front that you all are doing. And I think we often think about the United Way as, a fundraising organization. And in fact, it's critical to get resources into the community and to help, shift the opportunities for those that are more disadvantaged. So resources are absolutely critical, but I want to focus for a moment on the accomplishments that I heard earlier, and I'm going to repeat them because they're pretty amazing, and from my standpoint, they're pretty cool. The 211 number, that brings access to community services for people, and importantly, literacy and employment training. At the end of the day, what people want is a job, right? And we can't get ahead, if we don't have income. So the ability to actually provide that for people to help them get employment is so, so critical. And so that's a great one to start with. I love the fact that, Sandy talked about sort of the huge number of books that the community is getting out to poor and disadvantaged families. And I know many of you probably do some work in early childhood, but for those of you that don't, and we know this intuitively, but if you go into a poor family's household and you look at the number of books that are there, relative to a middle class or an affluent household, there's an order of magnitude fewer. And if you look at the number of words that are read to a child, typically in poor and low-income households relative to middle class and upper class, it's thousands of percent more. And we know that if, as a child, you're not reading by 3rd grade, we don't want to say it's game over, but you've got a lot to overcome. So when we talk about books to needy kids, on the one hand, we can say, well, that seems nice. On the other hand, that's absolutely critical to helping that child be successful in life. It's absolutely critical. The fact that you guys are doing that is so cool. The savings on prescriptions costs for the underinsured and uninsured, just really meaningful, obviously, in households that are scraping by. To be able to, we all know how expensive prescription drugs are at this point. I want to focus on the last 2 things that Sandy mentioned because they're really a great jumping off point for what I want to talk about this morning. The work that's being done that I know many of you in the room are touching around the 10-year plan to end homelessness, and not only the plan, but the ongoing work that's coming out of it. So what we want to talk about here, and we're still early stage with that, but what we want to talk about here is sort of how we can help an entire community. And so the plan to end homelessness, and in terms of bringing together an entire community to work together, is so critical. The Bridge to Success that Dalton spoke about, which is a coordinated effort to basically help every child in Waterbury, advance from cradle to career, is a new way of thinking, bringing together community-based organizations with the districts, the school superintendent involvement, et cetera. I was actually at a talk earlier this year in Hartford that was attended by the Bridge to Success folks there, and Dalton was there, and Kristen was there, and Lori Hart was there, and the school superintendent was there. And Waterbury was really being profiled in, this was a state initiative called the First 1,000 Days about how to bring knowledge to children and families around the state. And Bridge to Success here in Waterbury was being profiled as really an exemplary program. And so I got to hear a little bit about it and actually had a chance to react to it. And one of the shining moments for me was, we are in real challenged straits at this point in terms of how we actually advance and bring organizations together to work together. And often there's a great disconnection not only between organizations, but between organizations and the communities. And there was a great moment where somebody asked of the Waterbury folks, how are you actually sort of engaging with parents and children, and how are you finding out what parents need? And Dalton said, well, we go out and we ask them. And we talk to them. And blinding flash of the obvious, it doesn't happen. It doesn't happen a lot. And to be able to do that, and do that at some level of scale, is fairly extraordinary. So I want to use those 2 programs, the 10-year plan to end homelessness and Bridge to Success, as really a jumping off point for what I'd like to talk about this morning. And to do that, here's what I want to do, or what I'd like to suggest, is that, I'd like to challenge all of you to maybe shift your attention a bit. And first, I'd like to talk to the partners of the United Way. So if you're involved, you consider yourself a partner because you're providing resources, either financial or volunteer resources to help the United Way, or you're providing services and you're in partnership with the United Way in that mode, raise your hand. Okay, great. So here's what I want to suggest to you. There is something that's happening in this community, and many of you are involved with it, that can be transformative. That can be transformative in terms of the way that we collectively work together to address serious social problems and environmental problems. And I want you to pay attention, maybe in a different way than you typically have when you've thought about your organization or you've thought about the specific intervention or resource that you're providing. I want you to pay attention to what's happening here in Waterbury, that's happening in other communities across the United States, that's happening in the world, that is a different orientation to saying we're not going to work individually, we're going to work collectively. And what I want to try to do for you is unpack what that looks like. The topic here today, let's make sure I got my slides up, is about collective impact. Some of you may have heard that term. Some of you may not have. But what we're here to talk about is really what it means to achieve progress collectively. We've done a lot of work around sort of how you do that well versus how you do it not so well. We know collaboration is absolutely critical, but collaboration has been happening for a long time. It's very hard to do, and it often does not achieve results. So what I'd like to do for you is shift your attention from thinking about specifically your organization and your intervention to thinking about how you can contribute collectively to what's going on here in Waterbury. So that's for the partners. How many of you are either United Way staff or on the United Way board? Okay, great. Now, I think many of you know that the United Way itself, not just here in Waterbury, but around the world is in the midst of a transition. Is in the midst of a transition from focusing on sort of bringing resources into the community to how they can lead and help transform communities. And it's not an easy transition. But what's exciting to me is that leadership up and down the line in United Ways are committed to this. They're committed to a different way of operating in a way that is going to help transform communities by the leadership that you all are bringing. And so what I want you to think about is how do I pay attention to that and how does it happen? Because what we're talking about here is a very different way of operating than we have traditionally operated when we thought about sort of helping the nonprofit sector and actually addressing social problems. So what I want to do is talk briefly about sort of where we are today as we think about the progress that we want to make and where we might head, and try to give you a bit of a different vision, hopefully a helpful vision for the future in terms of what things might look like. I think if you're like me, many of us wake up in the morning and God, things feel so sort of depressing and insurmountable. And if you're somebody who's working in the community, and we've seen things like a 12-year-old girl who's pregnant a decade too early, or a father abuses his young son and doesn't suffer any consequences, that can get you. You sort of feel like everything's depressing and insurmountable. On the other hand, there's some days you wake up and wow, we might be on the brink of something that's exciting and unprecedented. In my work or in your work, you might get involved with a family that's really sort of disconnected from help, and you figure out a new program that actually links them up to resources, as we were talking about earlier. Or you're involved in helping a child who's been very emotionally scarred, a very young child, putting them into a daycare setting that's enriching and nourishing. And all of a sudden you think, wow, we could be on the verge of something exciting and unprecedented. Well, I think for most of us, we sort of teeter from day to day, from depressing and insurmountable to sort of exciting and unprecedented. And the question is, which way do we want to lean? Which way do we want to lean? I want to back us up to thinking about sort of the big picture out there. And I think whether or not you're involved specifically in healthcare or education or the environment or poverty reduction, when you bring yourself up to about 50,000 feet, we're all facing real similar problems in terms of how we choose to try to make progress. I think the question that, many of us have regardless of the issue we're working on, is how do we make faster, better, larger progress against the specific problems that we care about and the people that we want to help. You guys feel that way? Feel we got it licked? Yeah, how do we get faster, better, smarter, larger, quicker? How do we do that? Well, you know, there are a lot of things that hang us up in terms of accomplishing what we want to do, in terms of improving high school graduation rates or improving access to health care or cleaning up, you know, a particular river. And sometimes it's, you know, we don't have enough money to achieve outcomes at scale. And sometimes it's there's not enough public will in the community to sacrifice, to make the sacrifice. And sometimes it's we don't have the right talent and human resources to get the job done. And those are all challenges that we all face every day as we do this important work. But I would suggest to you that the number one largest challenge that we face in terms of addressing social environmental problems is this challenge that I'll call isolated impact. You know, regardless of the issue, there's 1.6 million nonprofits in the United States. 1.6 million. And so here in Waterbury, there are dozens upon dozens of organizations who are doing great work, but they can't do it alone. So I want to ask you if there's a way that we can think about what if nonprofits, foundations, government, and business moved from working in an isolated fashion to shifting to work in a collective fashion to achieve collective impact together in an aligned and coordinated way. You know, that's a question. I've been doing this for about 12 years at this point, working on addressing social problems. I work with an organization, as was pointed out earlier, FSG, formerly Foundation Strategy Group. And we have about 120 people, and we work around the world. And we asked ourselves this question about 4 years ago and said, you know, if this is what we're doing with our lives, what do we need to do to help support other organizations and individuals who want to make better, faster, larger progress? So what does it need to look like? And we were working with lots of organizations that look like many of you in the room, and even organizations at a global level. And we knew that it had to do with working collectively, but we didn't have a real clear idea of what that formula, if you will, looked like for working collectively, because there's been plenty of collective action over the history of the world, but most of it has failed to achieve positive and consistent progress at scale. So we went out and we looked at a number of different initiatives out there that we felt were actually achieving positive and consistent progress at scale. And what was interesting is there weren't a lot of them, but those that were achieving positive and consistent progress at scale typically had 5 conditions that were in place in their work. And keep in mind what we're thinking about here, as we're thinking about with the 10-year plan to end homelessness or Bridge to Success, is organizations across sectors. So we're talking foundations, nonprofits, government, and business, coming together, working together in a cross-sector way, and first getting on the same page with a common agenda. So deciding as a community what, A, the problem is, because often when different organizations and individuals come to the table, they have a different understanding of what the problem is, and then agreeing to jointly approach and address that problem together, and hold each other accountable for results. That's a common agenda. The second thing they had in common was the development and an approach that said, okay, we're going to think about, you know, measuring ourselves in a shared way. So we're going to pick, you know, a finite set of indicators that what success looks like. And we're going to track that over time at a population level, but we're also going to use that information to bring ourselves together to say, how are we doing and what do we need to change? That's shared measurement. The third condition that was in place in these initiatives was what we called mutually reinforcing activities. You know, we all know that we're going to be facing an environment going forward, particularly over the next 10 to 20 years, where there's fewer public resources available than there have been in the past. And we can all say, well, gee, how could we ever solve these problems? I would submit that against most of the issues that we're all working against and care deeply about, there may be enough resources there. They're just not aligned. Sometimes they're working at cross purposes. But when you look at the initiatives that were actually making progress, they had mutually reinforcing activities. The fourth was basically an approach that said, okay, literally among hundreds of organizations, and I'll talk about how this happens, there's regular communication between these organizations that builds trust and collaboration and builds relationships so that people can work together and can understand what's going on a regular basis and can think about how they continuously improve. I got you guys on tenterhooks as we get to the fifth condition here. How are we doing? Can you do that manually for me? There we go. Cool. So the fifth condition was what we call the backbone organization. And this is probably the number one reason collaborative efforts fail. But what is a backbone organization? Well, it is what it sounds like. When you think about hundreds of organizations and thousands of individuals working together, how are they going to work in concert? Typically, you need one organization or a set of resources whose sole responsibility is the alignment and coordination of everybody else. That's what a backbone organization is. It facilitates, it's helped guides and shepherds strategic direction. It is not in control. Be clear on that. This is not command and control. It's about facilitating and helping other organizations come together. And again, our experience was the number one reason that most collaborations fail is that there's a failure to put in place the appropriate backbone resources. So you look at these 5 conditions, the reality was there weren't, when we looked at this about 4 years ago, a lot of efforts out there that actually had all of these 5 conditions in place. Can you advance the slides for me? But what's interesting is over time, we're starting to get a better sense of, where these 5 conditions actually exist in initiatives across the country and around the world. And what's interesting is that it's not restricted to any one particular issue area. It really is how we make progress as a society against social and environmental problems. And you could put under homelessness the work in Waterbury around the 10-year plan to end homelessness, and you could put under education Bridge to Success. Based on what I've seen, I think those are both great initiatives that are moving in this direction. I want to tell you a little bit, we'll sort of peek under the hood. So we know about the 5 conditions, and I'm going to move reasonably quickly because I know you all want to get on with your days. But I want to talk a little bit about a couple of the initiatives that are in fact achieving extraordinary progress. Now, Bridge to Success here was inspired by an initiative in Kentucky and northern Cincinnati that involves over 300 organizations that include community-based organizations, foundations, the school districts, city government, faith-based organizations, all coming together in an aligned and coordinated way against these 5 conditions. And they've really had extraordinary success. This is an education reform initiative, cradle to career, that again looks very similar and in fact inspired Bridge to Success. We wrote about this a number of years ago. And they've achieved extraordinary success. They track 34 indicators community-wide, just 34, but they're things like kindergarten readiness and 3rd grade reading, and high school graduation and college readiness. And they look at 34 of them, and every year, just as we're doing with Bridge to Success here, they track how we're doing against those 34 indicators. 5 years ago, or 5 years into the program, they were making progress with 81% of those indicators. A year prior to that, 74%, progress with 74% of those indicators. The year prior to that, 68%. Just really, really powerful results at a community level. And again, Bridge to Success is very much predicated on that. Next slide, please. In healthcare, community up near Boston called Somerville, Mass, 80,000 people, very ethnically diverse. Took an approach to childhood obesity, brought over 70 organizations together, including the United Way, restaurants involved in this initiative for childhood obesity prevention, the city, Tufts University, community-based organizations came together, and in a 3-year period were actually able to cite that they had actually lowered children's body mass, but their weight, by a statistically significant percent. And we were starting with 44% of these children in this ethnically diverse community being obese. Next slide, please. In Chicago, an effort around workforce development, where was initially just foundations and funders, but they ultimately brought in nonprofits and government and business, and they set a goal of moving 5,000 people from public housing who didn't have jobs into jobs in 5 years. And in that 5-year period, they actually moved 6,000 people into jobs, exceeding their rate by 20%. And then finally, in a community west of here, in western Massachusetts, can we have the next slide, please? This is an area that's about 80,000 people. It's rural Massachusetts. It's 30 communities, about 880 square miles. Western Massachusetts. Not a lot of resources there. Over 8 years, in a collective impact effort focused on reducing teen substance abuse, they've been able to reduce binge drinking by, 44%, reduce smoking by 42%, and reduce marijuana use by 28%. Just extraordinary results that we're seeing. Next slide, please. Now, I want to just briefly reference, this is a different way of operating, and it does require a different mindset change. You got to think differently about doing work. One thing is you need to understand that making progress in these initiatives is about working together in an adaptive orientation in a way that sort of says, we don't know the answers, but we're going to work with the folks that are engaged in this and make progress over time. It's not a technical answer, so it's not about sort of just bringing in the right solutions. It's an adaptation. Next slide, please. We need to understand that in this work, making progress at scale, at a population level, Waterbury-wide, there is no one silver bullet. We don't have silver bullets, but we do have silver buckshot. The times that we make progress as a society is not just sort of one answer. It's making progress on a lot of little fronts that add up to big fronts. Next slide, please. And finally, it's a mindset shift that says we're not here to just take credit for our own individual interventions and what we do. We do want to create credibility for our organization, but we have to understand that there are going to be times when we think about advocacy and other sorts of efforts where we're going to make more progress as an organization when we work to others. And that is particularly hard for board members to understand, and particularly hard for funders to understand, but it is a mindset change that's absolutely critical. Now, how does that happen? Next slide, please. It happens because there's a very structured and disciplined and rigorous approach to this work. We've been involved in dozens of collective impact efforts. We've researched several dozen more. And all of these efforts typically have this approach. And this isn't a great, a perfect picture, but there's an overall steering committee, if you look in the top left-hand corner, of leaders within the community that are cross-sector who touch a particular issue, like cradle-to-career education, that are overseeing things. They are not in a command and control situation, but they are stewards of what we call this common agenda, and they help it get developed. Then we have to chunk up the work. We have to say, okay, we got to figure out, how we, to take education, for example, how folks in early childhood work together, how folks in access to college work together, and we need to understand the linkages between those areas. So we need to chunk the work up and get people involved in those specific areas, but we very much want to tie together the work that they're all doing. Now, how does that happen? Typically, it's this backbone organization, which is not generally a lot of people. It's one individual, it's 7 or 8 individuals, but it can contribute to facilitating collective action amongst literally hundreds of organizations. It provides transparency. When this structure is working well, it's not top-down, it's not bottom-up. We live in a world where top-down won't work to do our work, and bottom-up, as they say, doesn't add up. Okay? This is both top-down and bottom-up, and it's sideways. It's a very fluid process. It's structured and rigorous and disciplined, but it's also flexible and organic. It's structured, rigorous, and disciplined, but it's also flexible and organic. Now you ask, how could it be both? Well, I want to show you a 30-second video just to give you a vision of what that might look like when something is structured and rigorous and disciplined, and literally hundreds, in some instances thousands of entities involved, but it's also flexible and organic. So 30-second video, you'll start to see some birds flying.
And then, when the moment is right, they can take it away. Should be impossible.
So there you have it. Structured, rigorous, disciplined, flexible, and organic. So scientists have studied why it is that birds fly, birds flock, bees flock, fish flock. And they've actually determined that there's just 3 simple rules that if you're a bird, you follow. One is that you fly at the same speed as your neighbor. The second is that you stay equidistant from each of your neighbors. And the third is that you always turn toward the center. 3 simple rules that govern complex interactions. I use this as a metaphor, and it's actually not a metaphor, it's actually reality. When we're addressing complex social problems, we need to think through the lens of how complexity works. And in complex situations, one of the ways you think about it is simple rules that govern complex interactions. So think about the birds, but think about these 5 conditions as simple rules. There's no prescription in there. They're simple rules around interaction. And that is the nature of how collective impact works. That is the nature of the stuff. It's very different than most of us are used to. Simple rules that govern complex interactions. What's interesting is that 2 interesting facts about our birds. One is that this collective flock, part of the reason that birds flock is to avoid predators, is to stay away from buildings. This collective flock has 50 times the response time of any one individual bird. And that's what we're looking at. If we can even get 1/10 of that response time, we increase by 5 times how quickly we can get things done, how quickly we can sense what's going on. And the second thing is you take away one of those rules, and it doesn't work. So when we think about the 5 conditions for collective impact, what we've seen, because we've been at this for a number of years, is you need all 5 conditions. You need all 5 conditions. So I want to just sum up, if you'll skip the next slide and go to the last slide. Click through all this. I think you're going to have to click through it all the way. There's 5. So just a couple of things about the nature of this work. And what I want to do is give you a window into how this is different than typically how we think about doing our work. This is a process of perpetual sort of planning and doing. And it's very different than most of it. Usually, we think about do the 5-year plan, go implement, and come back and do for 5 more years. This is a process of continually planning, looking at what's going on, paying attention to what's going on, doing, checking that out, revising. It's a very different way of operating. But with this structure, you can do it. The second thing is allow for the shock of the possible. This is a process where literally you can get hundreds of organizations involved. And you will see stuff happen if you follow the rules that you never thought could have happened. And if we had more time, I could give you some great stories of that. The third is pay attention to relationships. It's the relationships that allow us to get done different stuff. And if you think about these 5 conditions, they actually are supportive of more relationship development in this process. The fourth is listen, 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 and think about how to respond to unanticipated challenges. The nature of this work and the nature of complexity and the nature of social change is things are changing all the time. And so we need to be very sensitive to what's happening. And that's something that, again, typically has not been how we think about sort of planning and then implementing. And finally, what I'd like to leave you with is my favorite Peruvian proverb, which is that the world will be changed by those with burning patience. That's what this takes. You've got to have that burning passion inside and say, we're not going to accept anything less than scale change. But you've got to have that compassion and empathy for the other. You have to have that compassion and empathy for the other, or this doesn't work. It takes burning patience. So that is my final wish for all of you, that you become good people of burning patience, and thank you very much for your time this morning.